Do you see my...
Admitiendo.
Sí lo
Okay.
vemos, Jorge.
Okay.
Buenos días a todos.
Buenos días. Good
Buenos días.
morning, everyone.
Buenos días.
Should I start, doctora?
¿Cómo va la admisión? Pregúntale a
41.
Chucho, por favor.
Tenemos 41
No, sí, ya,
participantes.
ya
Okay.
está todo el mundo admitido.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. Buenos días a todos. Today is our last day of this seminar, and today, as you know, we have the presence of our key speaker, Penelope Hawkins, that is going to give us her main lecture that is called Debt and Development Finance Branch. For today, after this presentation, we have another two panels, and the last one is going to be a book launch, and this is going to be the activity for today. I would like to thank Professor Penelope Hawkins for being here with us, and Professor Ximena Echenique for help us with the moderation of this keynote. Thank you, everyone. I'm going to say this in Spanish. Gracias a todos por estar acá. Para hoy día tenemos la conferencia magistral de la doctora Penelope Hawkins, que se llama Deuda y Desarrollo Financiero. Y después de esta presentación tenemos otras 3 mesas. Al final de a la última será la presentación de un libro, y esa es la estructura del seminario de hoy. Quiero agradecer la presencia de la doctora Hawkins y la ayuda de la doctora Ximena Echenique, que nos moderará la conferencia magistral. I would like to give you the word without hesitation to Ximena Echenique. Thank you, Professor Echenique. You have the floor for you.
Muchas gracias, Jorge. Thank you for everyone. It's an honor for me to moderate the Penelope Hawkins Magistral Conference, Restructuring of Capitalism in Developing Countries, the Role of Foreign Investment, Large Corporations, and Sovereign Debt. I will allow myself to read Penelope Hawkins' resume. PhD Hawkins is a senior economist in the Debt and Development Finance branch within the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, UNCTAD. In her current position, she researches and engages with member country representatives and the broader civil and academic society on sovereign debt, finances for development, illicit financial flow, and financial inclusion. Previously, as the founder and managing director of Sociability Ltd., she undertook leading research projects in the financial sector in South Africa, commissioned by regulators, policymakers, and private sector. Her expertise in the financial sector stems from her published work, including her PhD thesis that examined the financial constraints of small open economies and extended the analysis of financial fragility, vulnerability, and exclusion to nation as well as business. Her body of knowledge includes debt, financial architecture, market conduct regulation, consumer credit policy and regulation, financial inclusion, and the microcredit industry. Her forthcoming publication, Routledge, and 2022, is the festschrift in honor of Professor Sheila Dow, Expanding Economics Thought to Meet Contemporary Challenge in 2 volumes, Monetary Economics, Banking and Policy and Economic Methodology, History and Pluralism, co-edited with Ioana Negru. PhD, Penelope Hawkins, you have 40 minutes to present your paper. Then I will take some questions to your answer. Please, you could start.
Thank you very much, and thank you for that very kind welcome. I'm going to share my screen. If you can just bear with me 1 minute and see if I can get this right.
Penny, could you speak up, please?
Yes, can you hear me now? Is that better?
Yeah.
Yes.
May I ask if you can see the screen?
Yes, we can.
Yes,
say
it's
it.
okay.
Wonderful, thank you. So thank you very much for the warm welcome. It's a delight to be here. I was delighted by yesterday's in session where it was so obvious that there was an open and warm engagement with ideas, as well as excellent ideas. So thank you very much. When I had a look at the title that Numi suggested I have a look at, I thought to myself, this reminds me a little of my master's thesis. I remember that at the time I was highly enthusiastic and thought that I could deal with money and employment and development. It was a little bit like that. So if you bear with me, I'll just point you to what I think is the agenda for this afternoon. So I'm going to talk about where we are now, how did we get here, and then I'm going to talk about liquidity preference, and I'm going to end up by hopefully setting out some points for hope in the future. I'm going to start with a quick stock take. We know that we are in a system of hyperglobalization, super profits, and debt crises. And this has been the topic and the sort of underlying analysis of many of the papers in the last 2 days. The key thing behind this, of course, is that globalization does benefit some, but only a few. And that in fact, what we have seen over the last 3 decades in particular is that trade has become a very big firm game. If you look at this graph that I've got on the right-hand side, what we're trying to do there is for all developing countries is to see what share of total exports the top 1, 5, and 25% of exporters make up. And you should be able to see that the top 5, for example, typically take up 80% of the exports from developing countries. And of course, this leads us to yesterday's discussion, which I thought was very revealing, where we perhaps have been encouraged not only to think of global value chains, but global inequality chains, or perhaps even immiseration chains. And in particular, the role of TRIPS and IP has been very important. We know that TRIPS is the trade-related aspects of intellectual property, which came into force through the World Trade Organization in 1995. Although there has been some carve-out by developing countries, typically we see that bilateral arrangements that developing countries make with their partners tend to be TRIPS plus. That is, they are even more stringent and have an even longer term painted extension. And these kinds of regulations within the system have often been dominated and encouraged by multinationals so that they in fact benefit from trade disproportionately. We see this also when we think about the digital economy. We know that the digital economy is dominated by very few big players. This was borne out patently during the COVID period. And I think if we have a look at the following 2 data graphs, you can see some of the points that we've been trying to make in UNCTAD. On the left-hand side is almost a crocodile jaw. The pink line represents the share of profit that has been, if you like, gobbled by transnational corporations since 1995, as opposed to the declining share, which is the blue line of the labor income. And this is all relative to a 1995 reference, which is this black line here. On the right-hand side, we can see how the very large IT companies, in fact, they're just 1% of the top companies. The top companies represent 1% of the sector, but you can see that they have, by the end of this period, which is 2015, account for 52% of market capitalization, although only 27% of the share in employment. And at the same time, of course, there has been this debt explosion around the world, but particularly in developing countries. The data we've got here look at developed countries on the top graph and developing countries in the latter. And you can see that these data reflect rampant financial deregulation with the rise of not only the mega banks, but of course also the shadow banking sector. And that has led to a wave of privatized credit creation, which of course has exposed developing countries to excessive foreign lending, subsequent financial crisis, and has transformed their debt into fair game for financial investors in search of short-term gains. Just on the side here, I've got a picture just for context of, to give you a sense of the share of Latin American external debt stocks as a share of all of the low and middle income developing countries, and that's around 28%, almost 30%. Now, what do I mean about the debt of developing countries becoming a business? And I think there are two data sort of points that I'd like to reference this with. The first is a graph which looks at the share and of the ownership of government debt. And if you look at these bar charts and how they step up over a period of time, the first three, or the lowest three colors represent foreign non-banks, foreign banks, and the foreign official sector. And the areas that's being squeezed out is domestic ownership. And at the bottom graph shows us how private corporate debt has been growing much faster than private capital stocks. And we've shown this through this, this chart where we've plotted the position for countries over a period of, well, since the global financial crisis until 2015. And what you see there is how the growth of non-financial corporate debt, loans, and debt securities, which is along the horizontal axis, compares to the growth of private capital stock on the vertical axis. And of course, the vast majority of the countries shown here are pictured below the 45-degree line, indicating that their non-financial corporate debt is growing much faster than private capital stock. And so there's this notion that in fact, corporate debt is not producing the development outcomes that countries need, and instead is contributing to rising debt service costs and, of course, ultimately heightened vulnerabilities. If we're looking at debt sustainability over a period of time, of course, we have to acknowledge that at the turn of the century, debt sustainability, particularly for low-income countries, was much, much worse. And of course, what happened at that time was that there was an international drive for a jubilee forgiveness. And so we saw the HIPC and various other debt relief schemes reducing the debt of the lowest income and poorest countries. But from the year 2008, you start to see how for all different groupings of developing countries, the total external debt to exports has started to rise. If we look at a number of countries that have total external debts worth more than 250% of their exports, we can see that by 2020, which of course is the first full year that we actually have an understanding of the impact of COVID, you can see that the number of countries that have this growing debt unsustainability has doubled from 22 to 49. Then if we continue to look at external debt stocks and exports, and we look at different groups of countries, different regions, we can see how Latin America and the Caribbean has become the most vulnerable after sub-Saharan Africa. So sub-Saharan Africa, if you like, had the worst COVID period, but that doesn't, hasn't really shifted the role too much of debt in Latin America and the Caribbean. And in these data here, I'm showing you the external debt stocks to exports as an average for Latin America and Caribbean. It's now at 208%. And on the right, you can see the countries for whom this is very much higher. Mexico is, in fact, of course, in a much more advantageous position than many of the regional compatriots. But you can see how 10 countries already have thresholds of over 200, have breached the 250% threshold. If we then look at the servicing of this debt, and we're now talking about public and publicly guaranteed debt servicing to government revenue, you can see for low-income countries and low middle-income countries and upper middle-income countries, you can see how this has risen in recent years. For lower middle-income countries in the Latin America and Caribbean, and for the upper middle-income countries, you can see that it has been rising fairly steadily over the last years. And in some cases, for the lower income, middle-income countries, this number is well above the average of 13%. For example, in Dominica, in Honduras, even in Mexico, in Panama, and so on. Now, those data, just let that sink in for a minute. The servicing on the public and publicly guaranteed external debt now accounts for 13% of the, on average, if you're a lower middle income country, or 10%, close to 11% if you're an upper middle income country in Latin America and the Caribbean. And of course, that in many cases exceeds what countries are spending on health and potentially also education. So we see that we now need to ask the question, how did we get here? And I think this has much to do with the empty promises of our profession. First of all, this notion of convergence and also of the law of comparative advantage. The proponents of liberalization have had us believe that openness and perfect capital mobility will fix all problems with smallness. While, of course, as price takers, small countries would lose control of domestic interest rates, and they would also lose control of management of inflation, they would have the benefits of convergence. And in this argument, achieving both internal and external balance in the economy is actually trivialized. So the scarcity of savings, or what we might call investable funds, is addressed by financial liberalization. Foreign capital will simply flow in. Now, the law of comparative advantage added to this tells us that market competition in such an open environment will promote relative efficiencies, and that, of course, will increase the global supply. Demand will expand in turn, and given that capital and labor are immobile, persistent trade imbalances will exist only due to inefficiencies or profligate tendencies. Now, of course, we know from work that has been done on liquidity preference, on center periphery, on dependency theory, that in fact, this has not been our outcome. Shackle said that money enormously enlarges the hurtful power of uncertainty at the same time that it enormously facilitates the beneficent power of specialization. And Keynes, of course, showed us that the existence of liquid assets in a world of uncertainty leads to a possibility of persistent unemployment. And of course, he was talking primarily in a closed economy because he wanted to show, I think, how general this problem was. Then many theorists have extended this to an international setting, including Dow, Chick, Davidson, Kriegel, and many others. and of course have shown that liquidity preference acts as a constraining tendency. In turn, the theory of comparative advantage is undermined. If there is no guarantee that global effective demand will increase in line with the supply made possible by specialization and trade, and given that in fact labor and capital are mobile, an absolute advantage and therefore a winner takes all possibility is made possible. Of course, this leads us to this discussion of the balance of payments constraint and the notion that the reliance on capital goods imports means that while imported capital goods may increase productivity, they do not necessarily increase effective demand, which of course is exported. So the ongoing reliance on capital goods means that the current account deficit is structural. And of course, as Thirlwell's law set out, growth becomes determined firstly by the balance of trade. If you were just considering trade, we can see that the balance of payments rate of growth is determined by the rate of growth of exports and the income elasticity of the demand for imports. And when we include the financial account, of course, this all reverts to the dependence on capital inflows. And if a small developing country is, the deficit in a small developing country is enabled by capital inflows, it becomes successively more steeped in debt. And because of liquidity preference, push factors, those factors that are external to developing countries, dominate the pull factors. And instead of convergence, we see preference for reserve currencies and center assets. And so financial openness and capital mobility threatens the achievement of economic and social goals, and capital controls become necessary for stability and growth in employment and output. I think I'd like to just turn now to a fairly recent book that has been sets out the role of Latin American theorists in the multilateral space. And this book by Margarita sets out the some of the dynamic and innovative and also determined economists that have been associated with CEPAL, or in English what we refer to as ECLAC, the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, which was established in 1948, for which Raul Prebisch had significant influence. And of course, he was also the first UNCTAD Secretary General. And of course, his theory was that the existing pattern of production and trade placed Latin America and the world's periphery at an extreme disadvantage. And of course, this also led to dependency theory, which of course informed this notion not only of the center periphery, but of dependency. And of course, these kinds of trade patterns hindered national accumulation and widened the global gap between the center and periphery. And of course, in particular, foreign exchange limitations and import substitution needs are at the heart of this periphery problem. And so in order to overcome underdevelopment, developing countries needed to promote industrialization and improve their terms of trade. But of course, that leads to a development paradox. As countries produce for the domestic market, trying to reduce their demand for imports through import substitution, that leads to a short-term dependence on foreign exchange. And of course, that short-term is somewhat in inverted commas, simply because it takes a long time to overcome these structural problems of the periphery. And at the same time, of course, there's this demand for imported technology and equipment, which leads to a demand for foreign exchange and ultimately external resources. So, of course, this demand for external resources ultimately leads to the need for return flows of interest payments and profit remittances. And when the return flows outweigh the earnings flows, of course, there is that persistent notion that developing countries are giving more than they receive. Of course, with a current account deficit and growing debt servicing and stocks of net foreign claims, these can only be covered by additional foreign capital inflows. And so we have a kind of international Ponzi scheme setting in, where the stability depends on the willingness of creditors to continue to lend. And so we're back in the world of liquidity preference. So developing countries now work to bolster lender confidence by building up foreign exchange reserves, undertaking fiscal austerity. But of course, that enhanced financial credibility ultimately undermines real capital and structural transformation and limits the ability of countries to finance its borrowing. And so we end up in a vicious cycle. We've had a look at how we could try and measure that in UNCTAD, and we have this picture that we refer to as a topsy-turvy world. And of course, the reason we call it topsy-turvy is because what it shows is that the net transfer of resources goes from developing countries rather than to developing countries. And we are tracking here three different sets of curves. The first, the orange curve on top, is the official development assistance, or what we refer to as aid. And you can see how relatively small that has been in the big scheme of things since the turn of the century. The dark blue line is the net transfer of resources from developing and transition economies to developed economies. And these are estimates based on these transfers of net capital, the difference between net capital inflows and net income payments to foreign capital, and of course also net changes in international reserves. And then this fractured line is an estimation of illicit financial flows. So you can see that if you see illicit financial flows going to the center, the net transfers of resources going to the center, then aid certainly does not counter that flow. And one way of trying to understand that is to think in your mind of the world's countries as somehow being on a spectrum of financial provision. On the one end, you have the super included, and of course that really points to the countries that have the highest reserve currency, and of course ultimately in the world in which we live, the US still is seen as that reserve currency. Then you have countries which are included. These are high income countries typically with investment ratings, and of course they are also types of reserve currency, but perhaps somewhat diminished in the hierarchy. And then you have fringe countries, and these countries are eligible on two sides. The most eligible fringe are those that are typically upper middle income countries. They have investment ratings, they have access to longer term maturity loans. And then there are those countries that are on the marginal fringe, who are perhaps lower middle income countries. They have speculative ratings, shorter term maturities. And then at the far end are the excluded countries. Typically, these are actually unrated countries. They're not part of asset managers' indices, as we saw yesterday. And these are the countries that are relying almost exclusively on concessional finance and aid, and of course, increasingly on remittances from the diaspora. Why do I like liquidity preference so much? I think, you know, liquidity preference for me seems to lie at the bottom of all of these stories that we tell about development, whether they are about center periphery, whether they are about dependence. And for me, it's very strongly linked to our notion of money. Yesterday, John spoke primarily about money as a store of value and a means of payment. For post-Keynesians, also, of course, the unit of account is very important. And all of those three roles give rise to the three motives for liquidity preference. And so money, or that preferred liquid asset, is held for transactions, precautionary and speculative reasons. Another reason why I think liquidity preference is something that we need to bear in mind is because it is a fulsome account of processes that lead to change. I'd like to reference Brian Arthur in a recent article called Economics in Nouns and Verbs. It's an article published this year. And he argues that the algebraic mathematics of our economics typically expresses the world in nouns and leaves out processes, formation, adjustment, and creation. And I think if we are to become better economists and economists that do not continue to mislead the world, then this is where we have to put our energy. Liquidity preference is also contributing to some work that we're doing within UNCTAD. We recently been looking at some work on mobilizing financial resources for development in the era of COVID, and we've developed a new model called the Sustainable Development Finance Assessment Framework, which really attempts to analyze how developing countries can achieve structural transformation together with the SDGs. And of course, we are looking at the most foundational SDGs in this case: no poverty, no hunger, good health, and quality education. And we're asking how developing countries can achieve that within the bounds of their external position within a financialized world. Now, standard debt sustainability assessments typically examine the financial needs associated with servicing existing sovereign debt. And so, of course, our point of departure is much broader. We're saying it's important not only that developing countries service their debt, but that we look at how they can transform while they are servicing their debt. And for us, the causality runs from the external account. The balance of payments provides the most relevant constraint because of this liquidity preference in the international arena for center assets. And we are trying to look at long-run solvency based on the ability to service the stock of net external liabilities. It's a heterodox model. It's reliant on the work by Kaldor or Thirlwell and Domar and Pazanetti, and also Baring and a group of other theorists. We've started with, in this work, looking at Pazanetti points, and we've termed them thus because, of course, what Pazanetti did was look at government deficits or surplus and government debt for 6 European countries at the time that the Maastricht Treaty was upon Europe. And he looked at the two ratios, 3% minus 3% government deficit and 60% for the debt ratio. And of course, that leads to only one possible combination for all countries. Or it leads to what we might see as a Pazanetti box, which determines where the country is operating within those criteria. Now, the UNCTAD SDFA assumes that, in fact, there are many possibilities of policy recommendations when countries find themselves in a position of unsustainable debt. And we think there are various combinations of macroeconomic and development policy, of which fiscal austerity is but one. In the more conventional models, as you know, fiscal austerity to achieve public debt sustainability is the logical conclusion of the model in the case of unsustainable external debt, primarily because the key point of departure for these models is that countries are operating at full employment. As you've seen, for us, you are operating within your balance of payments constraint. So let me give you some examples just to show you what happened to countries during COVID. Now, we've plotted here a series of points for 6 Latin American countries. I'll show you 3 on another page. Here you've got Argentina, Bolivia, and Brazil. And you can see how over a 10-year period, this starts in 2010, so over a 10-year period, where were the countries operating in terms of government deficit as a percent of GDP and then government debt as a percent of GDP. And you can see many of the countries were operating close to or at the Maastricht space around about 2010. But the final point where you see the red arrow in every case is what happened to countries during COVID. Then here are a group of countries that in fact are very much closer to the Pazanetti box, if you like. So Mexico steps out of the box here in 2020. Colombia takes a fairly large leap, and Chile also moves out of the box. But of course, these countries are in a slightly less precarious position than some of their compatriots. Now, what is the way forward if this is the picture that we've seen? And I guess the question that's been most on our minds in UNCTAD has been, are special drawing rights a game changer? Now, we know that in 2021, we had this massive issue of special drawing rights. It was unprecedented. $650 billion equivalent was issued according to the IMF quota. And as you know, the IMF quota has to do with country economic size and financial obligations to the IMF, as well as voting power. And so the problem was that, of course, given that there was this pandemic, which is indeed the reason why these special drawing rights were issued, the problem was that countries had to cope with an unprecedented situation, and the allocation by the quota system seriously disadvantaged developing countries. So, for example, while 36 advanced countries received almost 400 billion of the 650 billion, Africa received 33 billion, or 5%, and 54 V20 or vulnerable countries received 26 billion. This, of course, led to a call for rechanneling of SDRs. This idea that there should be a possible redistribution of 100 billion of these SDRs from rich countries. Of course, that would be hugely significant because, of course, it would be more than twice the entire concessional lending by MDBs in 2018. Now, in order to understand the role of these special drawing rights, it's useful to have a look at the take-up. The take-up rate of the 2020 SDR allocation by the IMF geographies shows that Sub-Saharan Africa massively utilized these special drawing rights, as did Latin America. The last little bar refers to the use by advanced countries, where only one of the 36 advanced countries made any use of the SDRs. Now, there's of course a very strong argument that SDRs could be channeled. There are different ways in which they could be channeled. They could be channeled via IMF trusts. There are two trusts, the Poverty Reduction and Growth Trust, which has existed for some time, and the Resilience and Sustainability Trust. The problem is with rechanneling is that it transforms the nature of SDRs, because when SDRs arrive in the hands of central banks around the world from the IMF, they are actually free and without condition. Once they have been on lent, they now become loans, and typically if they are being channeled through the IMF, then there will be policy conditionality associated. So as prescribed holders, MDBs could be using SDRs, first of all, by on-lending SDRs, as in the same way that the IMF on-lends through the trusts. Another way is that countries could be encouraged to inject their excess SDRs directly into MDBs. And we know that MDBs have a very strong development role, particularly in certain countries, although over time, of course, that may have been eroded. And here are some data showing the BRICS countries and how, in fact, even Brazil, which of course has become a world-renowned example of the role of developing banks, has had something of a fall off towards the end of this data, which ends in 2018. What are we saying as UNCTAD? For us, we believe that debt has to be tackled directly. And we've called for an expanded and revised idea of special drawing rights as a flexible and scalable financing mechanism for a very long time, at least the last 5 years. And what we believe that this was really underlined in importance when we had the SDR issuance that was so linked to quota, because the countries that most needed these SDRs did not receive them. And so we are calling for a new allocation, but one that has nothing to do with quota, that instead is designed to allow for environmental and other adjustment programs to take place. We also think that we should have a global SDG-related concessional lending program for low and lower middle income countries to enable them to actually borrow on concessional terms. And what is also necessary is a global sustainable development fund. Our SG has started to acknowledge that this General Assembly in the UN is actually our last best chance to ensure that we do come close to achieving the SDGs, which, as we know, that is an agenda for 2030. And we also think that there should be stronger regional monetary cooperation. And this is something that I think we would put forward within the space, and I suppose as a counter in some ways to that stronger regional monetary cooperation, which moves beyond regional reserve swaps and pooling arrangements, that actually could move to more full-scale development of regional payment systems and internal clearing unions would be constructive and particularly possible, I think, in Latin America. And we are also, of course, calling for a rules-based framework to facilitate an orderly and equitable restructuring of sovereign debt that can no longer simply be serviced according to the original contract, but is governed by a set of agreed principles and a body of international law. As you know, we have no organized, comprehensive mechanism that deals with sovereign insolvency. But we do have hope for the future. And I think there is hope in some of this story that I've told today. First of all, we have seen, as a consequence of these unprecedented times, that more and more countries have recognized that Maastricht is just one point, and that there was active macro policy during the COVID time. There was also active distributional policy through various furlough schemes through both the developed but also the developing world. And there was also there's also increasingly an active industrial policy narrative where people are talking about how there's an uncoupling from GVCs, which I think provides us some kind of incentive for thinking about alternative mechanisms going forward, particularly if we equate GVCs to GICs. And particularly in the climate and environmental narrative, there is the ability for developing countries to leapfrog technology so that they can in fact gain in the future. And then, of course, we also think that increasingly there is an argument for active infrastructure policy in terms of the role of MDBs and the DFIs, particularly on a regional basis. We would argue again that there is urgency in terms of the debt climate vicious cycle, where we see more and more very vulnerable countries increasingly debt burdened as a consequence of climate calamity. We know there are many countries like that in the Latin American and Caribbean region, and Pakistan is just the latest example. So debt relief and debt cancellation for developing countries need to be put on the climate agenda. They are not separate. And we think that that leads to some opportunity now as clearly the climate narrative is being engaged with on a far more determined and innovative way. I would also say that for me, the hope for us in unprecedented times lies in this kind of forum and you as the people listening to it. In this kind of forum, there's an openness to think about our discipline and the policy recommendations we have made and how we need to rethink them, especially for developing countries. You have the massive legacy of the Latin American intellectual contribution to development economics. And of course, you have a sense of openness to new information. We are living in a time where you as students have more information and more networking potential than any of us ever had. And so I think those are the key things that lead us to have hope in terms of restructuring capitalism so that it can work for development. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, PhD Penelope Hawkins. Thank you for your generous presentation that we can reflect about the main theories that explains the problems of debt and payment balance, be among other problems that affect the factors around the change of sovereign debt and how our policies macro being carried out. We have some questions, so I'm gonna give you the first. Could you tell us a little about the relationship between increasing debt, stocks, and mergers and acquisitions, and its reflect over physical accumulation on development and developing countries?
I'm so sorry. I was trying to unshare my screen, which I, for some reason, don't seem to be able to do just yet. And so I'm so sorry. I wonder if I could ask if you could just repeat it. I'm listening.
Perdón, sorry, Ximena, can you take a few questions and make some rounds? I think it would be better.
Yes.
Would it be possible?
Yes, I have a question that someone write on the chat. And the question say, could you tell us a little about the relationship between increasing debt, stocks, and mergers and acquisitions, and its effect over physical accumulation on development and developing countries?
Hay dos que queremos hablar.
Yes,
El
yes.
profesor Toporowski.
And if you, okay. And the other question is, Dr. Toporowski, if you go ahead, please, you can speak.
Thank you. If it's, I believe Naomi was before me, but Naomi will, I'm sure will get the chance. I found this a very, very interesting and stimulating or thought-provoking presentation. I think some of the insights are very good, you know, ones that I will have to think about. I do. One thing is that that interests me is, and I think which maybe you could say it's a little bit more about, is the distinction between internal debt in a government's own currency, and external debt. In other words, currency in debt in foreign currency, and I think this may address some of the issues that we I had been talking about with John Smithin yesterday and the day before. And the other factor is I'm very intrigued by this mechanism that you proposed, the climate change mechanism or the environmental program mechanism. And I wonder whether this might not be the incentive for participating in this may not be going really to the wrong countries, because in effect, the countries that have the biggest incentive for this would be the least developed countries that make the smallest contribution to global warming. And yes, there are some projects which may help elsewhere, but it would, in a sense, the real problem lies with the more industrialized countries and the middle income countries. Thank you.
Please, Dr. Noemi.
Gracias. Penny, thank you very much. Really a very challenging presentation and give us a lot to think. I want to put forward 3 ideas and how to go forward from that. I believe that Latin America, will speak about Latin America because I don't know much about Africa, have gone from a truncate industrialization process in the words of Tan Silver, an ECLAC theorist, to what I call a failed international insertion. This is what has happened in the last 30 years. What is the common with both sectors? The production, at least in Central America, is centered in high productive sectors with very low productivity. Gabriel Palma, who you might know, makes a lot of studies about the difference in the 70s, South Korea, Mexico, Chile, in productivity. It was lower in South Korea. Now we are about 40% lower. Why is that? Because the imports, the production is based on imports, also in the easy model like now. What are the results? And here I take off what you said, current account structural deficit. This has been before and today, more profound today than in the easy period. What is the result? We have to open, or not we have to open, but the result is to finance that, you open the financial account. Student Stallings made a very nice book showing that Southeast Asia opened much more the financial account because they had its current, they had surplus in their current account. So we get financialization through the external sector, and then we are dependent on financial centers. What to do? I think Bolivia have shown that domestic policies can be done in this open environment. Mexico is going very slowly to show the same. I don't know if it will be deep enough. Let's see what happens in Colombia. I think the problem is to restructure, and this I would wonder is the discussion, restructure the productive sector, yeah, to be less dependent on the financial sector. I think this is the curse of our economies. I would like your thoughts about this, and perhaps what to do if I'm correct, or perhaps nobody will agree with me. Thank you.
Okay. We have Professor John Smith, but we have 3 questions. So if you want PhD Penelope Hawkins, you can answer these 3 questions, and then I'm gonna give Professor John Smith the word and other question. Is it okay? PhD
Yes,
Penelope Hawkins? Okay, go ahead, please.
Okay, so thank you very much for the questions. They're quite broad ranging, and I guess that reflects the fact that this really is a broad-ranging set of topics about how to deal with the development problem. And I think, you know, perhaps I could start with Numi's intervention. This idea of the truncated industrialization, the failed internationalization, and this somehow preemptive stopping of a structural transformation that would really allow movement beyond, you know, movement beyond the periphery. And it seems to me that there is a real sense that, you know, if you are bound by a situation where we accept that there is a balance of payments constraint, you have to have growth of exports to improve, but there is no guaranteed market for what you're doing. Then, in fact, you end up with this potentially vicious cycle of what you're producing. So you produce, but it's not necessarily enough. It's at terms of exchange that don't benefit you. And so you become more indebted and more dependent. And I think this relates to this issue of the role of MNCs in the role in development. I mean, one of the things that we see in UNCTAD now, in the work that we're doing on MNCs, is that, or multinational corporations, is that they operate within their own subsidiaries. So the demand that exists, that they have as these companies that dominate exports, they buy from their own subsidiaries, and their own subsidiaries work within their own subsidiaries within countries, all of which allows this greater financialization and ultimately erosion of returns to the developing country itself. So we have a situation where I agree completely with you, Numi. I don't know enough about Bolivia, I'm afraid, to understand the story that you talk about there. I mean, I think that openness, you know, we cannot call, I don't think, for closedness, but we do need to talk about an openness where we have our eyes open and that we actually make it work for us as much as possible. And so you know, I don't think anything that I'm talking about here suggests that being closed is an option, but it is a situation where you have to understand the long run outcome of being open, unless you can manage that somehow with capital controls, unless you can actually examine create a world that is more, shall we say, designed to create good outcomes. And perhaps I'm getting a bit carried away here, but perhaps I could just refer very briefly to the London Agreement of 1953. And the London Agreement of 1953 allowed for German exports to be accepted by the rest of the world. In fact, there was a limit that was placed on the amount of debt that could be repaid by Germany, and it was determined by its export revenue. And today you saw how the debt servicing for many countries has become out of control. In the case of the London Agreement, it was set at a maximum, an understood maximum of around 5%. So the debt servicing could never be more than 5% of export revenue. Developing countries have never had that advantage. The mechanism by which people had incentive to buy the exports of Germany has never again been applied for developing countries. And so this I think is the key issue, is that how does one actually create a mechanism whereby countries can uplift themselves? And part of the story that we talk about here is the role of SDRs, because we see how necessary they have been and how quickly they have been employed in terms of a liquidity to deal with external debt indebtedness, and also in some cases even public domestic indebtedness. And I think that leads to the question that Jan raises about the distinction between internal debt and external debt. And yes, I think that this is, I mean, a very crucial thing that you have raised. And I think the key thing here is that we know that external debt leads to this vicious cycle that we've described, where, as Kriegel has set it out, it can lead to a Ponzi scheme, where you have to have more flows to service the existing outflows. And everything is dependent on the liquidity preference of those outside the country. Of course, if it's internal debt, then there is a slightly different dynamic. And of course, if it's internally held debt, then that is also very important. So it's not just public debt that's domestic and denominated in domestic currency, but it needs to be also held domestically. If it's held by foreigners, when there's a crisis, they leave. And so we have that problem that even the domestic debt needs to be managed very carefully. And again, it's a structural and systemic problem of the openness problem.
Excuse me, Doctor?
Yes.
Yes, I want to give the word because we have other question from John Smith, professor, and we have a little time more. So.
Yeah, thank you very much. Jorge always asks me to try to be brief. I will try. I would just like to remark first, that was a very interesting paper, of course, Penelope. And just preliminary, I take it you've been very influenced by my old friend and sometime co-author Sheila Dow. You know, I'm thinking about your discussion about liquidity preference and so on. You know, that's a very well, I think that's a very well placed emphasis. And it occurs to me that we've been talking about that for 45 years, I think. You know, now the time goes by. So the substance of it, I take it that the premise of the paper is that developing countries essentially have a current account deficit and capital inflow. And the complaint you started with is that imports, maybe they're tech imports or whatever imports, are dominated by the big multinationals. Well, I think, and that goes back to what I was saying yesterday, I think that by pursuing a, quote, monetary mercantilist strategy, that is macroeconomic policies veering on a monetary mercantilist strategy, we can turn this round. And I would say aim, and notice I use the word aim advisedly, for a current account surplus and capital outflow. And notice that that would be capital sort of denominated in the domestic currency. The domestic economy would be making their own money count as money. And a corollary, I think, of that is that they would be making their own products. It would be their own products made domestically, not stuff that comes from abroad. And we talked yesterday about the sort of adjustments that the various BRICS are making in this kind of new world order, so to say. Isn't that what they're doing? You know, like they're making their own tech and making their own other products and so on. I'd like to know what you think about that. Notice, I think, that you would not necessarily end up with a current account surplus, right? Because exchange rates would adjust, either flexible exchange rates or fixed but adjustable exchange rates. So you may well end up with trade balance, like on the global scale. But each individual country is striving for the current account surplus, as I say, monetary mercantilism. So I would like your reaction to that. You know, is that a viable strategy? Could that be done?
Okay, thank you. We have other question on chat. Is it okay for Dr. Penelope? I can read and then you can answer. Okay. How can we imagine an industrialization of Latin American countries when foreign firms don't share technology and don't build links with the domestic firms? In this context, I think that debt is not enough for recovering. What do you think about this? And I need to give the word to Dr. Mitton. Is it okay, Dr. Anomi? We have these two questions, so you can answer, please.
Super, thank you very much. So thank you very much to the question that you read out, I think is exactly right, in the sense that we have a problem where, yes, of course, simply dealing with debt is not enough. I agree with you. However, if we cannot deal with the debt, then of course all other possibilities become more and more remote. And so I think the reason why we focus on the debt in the first instance, John, sorry, I wonder if you've got your mic still on. John?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, I knew. Sorry about that. I'm making noise.
Thank you. That's super. Thank you. So for me, the issue here is that the debt is finding ways to deal with the debt is essential, but of course that doesn't mean that that's all that should go on. And I think more and more one needs to say, I mean, I think this relates to this point perhaps in a way that John raises about the role of the BRICS and perhaps regional leaders within specific regions. If the regional leaders were able to negotiate better capacity for this transfer of knowledge sharing, if we were able to deal better with the TRIPS and the TRIPS Plus system, where in fact there is a mechanism that directly looks at transferring technology within a region, and then perhaps these big leading firms, perhaps China, perhaps India, could utilize that as a kind of a spearhead so that the whole region could benefit, then I think we would have something good to hang on to. For an individual country, it's exceptionally difficult. I think for me, what I wanted to say and didn't say was that, you know, the big problem, I think, with there are a number of things where I would perhaps I want to respond to John, but I think one of our key points of differentiation is that I think that the notion of conceiving the BRICS as one kind of group of country is problematic, but I think they do play very particular regional roles that perhaps we could unpack and see in a particular way. I also think that going forward, a multilateral approach that really looks at technology transfer is increasingly becoming essential. And the reason I pointed to climate at the end is that I think there is this climate opening where people are saying, if we don't address the problems with the planet, then we will have nowhere to live. And so there's this urgency around the climate, and various things need to be associated with that, including the transfer of technologies enabling us to move to a greener industrialization. So I'm sorry, I don't have the answer to that, but I really agree with the notion behind the question. For John, yes, of course, I have worked with Sheila, and it is indeed an old idea, this issue of liquidity preference. But I don't think that necessarily means that it is a discounted idea. And I think, you know, the thing that I am concerned about with regard to the MMT is, you know, there is an experience of Tanzania in the 1970s which I think may be an example of a country that tried to pursue sovereign policy independently of international finance. And in fact, it became untenable as a mechanism. And the key thing for me, I think, is that MMT is being suggested without, I think, due reference to liquidity preference, because all of these suggestions that one can issue one's own currency and one can work within it without actually worrying about what's happening in the rest of the world, I think doesn't place the country firmly into international liquidity preference. And that's the difficulty I have with it.
You have 3 minutes more, please.
Penelope, if you want to deepen your arguments, there are other 3 minutes.
Thank you very much. Sorry, I thought I was being told to stop just then, but thank you for that. I want to just refer then perhaps to the point that was raised by Jan, and that was this issue of the climate mechanism, this climate moment. Is it indeed a climate moment, or is it again going to be something that does not necessarily benefit those countries who most need it? And for me, you know, this is one of these issues about multilateralism. If we can't get it right, then, you know, perhaps we do all need to move into a world of autarky. But there is this issue about incentive of participation. And I think that the reason why I think that the climate mechanism lumped together with debt has some validity is that it allows a country that is deeply unsustainable in terms of debt to create a path out of that, not only through debt climate swaps, but through other mechanisms that would allow it to leapfrog the technology and so on. If we could parcel these things together so that the South would actually see the structural benefit of actually moving towards greener industrialization, I think there is some potential for that.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I'm going to give the word. Go ahead, PhD Alonso Bustamante. Thank you so much, PhD Penelope Hawkins. And
thank you very much, Professor Penelope Hawkins, for your marvelous presentation. And I'm deeply sorry because we don't have enough time to go deep into the discussion. You know that we had a good discussion during these 3 days of the seminar. And I'd like to thank you, Professor Toporowski, Professor John Smithin, Professor Penelope Hawkins, for being here with us. It was marvelous. The discussion goes deep into the problems that we must confront in the next years. And for that, I thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much of you. Professor Noemi, if you want to say something more.
I only want to add that I'm sure this won't be the last time. We need to continue our discussion because it's of utmost importance for us, and I think for the world as a whole. And I'm sure we will continue, we'll make other seminars, and I hope you will accept our invitation. And in this sense, we move to the next table. Quisiera agradecerle a los profesores que aquí presentes.
Just say, Naomi, sorry to interrupt. Thank you all for, Jan and Penelope and all of you over the last few days. I think this discussion has been extremely useful. And it would be great to to continue it. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Bueno, lo que queríamos decir es que queremos agradecerle a los profesores aquí presentes, no solo los europeos, sino los latinoamericanos y del resto del mundo, en el sentido que esta discusión tiene que continuar, porque es de vital importancia para lo que se viene.
I want to say that for the next panels, the discussion will be in Spanish, and sorry for that. Okay. Doctora, por favor.
Sí, no sé si ya tenemos a todos los